start to explain what they are. So the positive space in a work, that is the figures or the objects that are the main focus. So if you're looking at like a still life painting or something, you have all these objects on a table. Those would be the positive objects, and then the space behind it most of the time is going to be the negative space. So it's like considered inactive. So that's sort of the general definition of those two. And there are cases where they can be reversed, and artists can call into question what is the positive and what is the negative space. And that we'll get to in a second. But I wanted to just quickly define the figure-ground relationship. So that is the relationship between a form or a figure and the background, the contrast between positive space and negative space. This relationship applies to many other subjects and isn't restricted to literal human figures. So even though it's called the figure-ground relationship, it can be whatever is the subject in your painting or drawing, or even sculpture. So positive and negative space are used to achieve a balanced composition. Many artists carefully plan and adjust their areas of positive and negative space for this reason. And a good way to think of positive and negative space is to consider the mantra, there's never a positive without a negative. So kind of an easy way to remember that. This is a pretty literal explanation of that. So the white blocks in this composition are obviously really starkly contrasting the red background. And the white rectangles are the positive shapes in this case, and the figures of the figure-ground relationship. The negative space is that red that is like surrounding them, that these are obviously on a field of red, and it occupies most of the canvas. So that's a pretty easy sort of example of that. This is Clouds by Isaac Levitin, and most people, as I said over here, will see the clouds as a subject of the painting, and the blue sky in between as the negative space, so like the inactive areas. And you can see how he kind of used the space strategically. So he put negative space in interesting sort of patterns, or like he kind of spread it interestingly throughout the canvas. But of course, I think that it would be fair to say that maybe the sky is, you could argue that the sky is the positive space and the clouds are the negative, but I think for the most part, people would agree that the clouds are positive and the sky is negative. So this is a really just kind of literally black and white, or almost white, explanation of positive space. So the branch and the birds are the clear active space, and then the sky, this kind of blue-gray background, it's a passive background, and it just exists around and between the active space. So it helps to kind of shape and carve out the active space. And you guys will notice that I may have said something similar in class when coming around and looking at your drawings, that looking at the space in between objects, measuring that space sometimes, just considering what that space is looking like can be very helpful. So, and then, as I said, this is sort of a subjective concept. So this is really a famous image. You guys have probably seen it at some point. This is Rubens' vase. And the viewers obviously can identify, especially on the right here, but on the left as well, the white space, especially when you're looking at this image on the left, the white space around it is reading as the negative space, and the yellow, this sort of like very clear form with definite shadow and light coming in from one side, that reads as the positive. And the negative space, when you look again, and you'll see it, obviously, your eyes will sort of like shift back and forth between this, but you can see that the side of each piece on the vase, they do look like two like human profiles facing one another, and that's very clear in the black image on the right. Obviously, this is more clearly outlined. There's no detail on the white anymore, so you can see pretty easily that this looks like two figures, and that then is reading as the positive space, and the white as the negative. So obviously, there's like this shift that's going on. And he's sort of like calling that into question here by adding in all the detail and the color and everything. I'm trying to make it sort of harder for you to see, but it is very clear on the right. So and I said at the bottom here, most viewers can see both, and once they see the illusion, it can be seen by simply like adjusting what you consider to be the subject of the painting. So so that's pretty clear as well. This is Magritte, and Decalomania is the name of this, which is appropriate because it definitely reads as a decal, sort of. But he's obviously providing us with the two figures, I'm guessing a self-portrait. And in the one on the left, this is more traditional and detailed. So it's kind of similar to the Rubens vase, where there's detail, there's light and shadow in the figure, and that would be considered sort of like the active space or the subject. And then the ground would be the background of the clouds and the water. And then obviously on the right, this is almost bisected perfectly, but not quite, by this curtain. And then on the right, this reads as the subject, but it is a background. So there's like, again, this sort of shift happening. And it definitely reads as like a cutout or a decal. So, and I noted that down here, decalomania refers to decalomania, which was a transfer technique that was later shortened to decal. And his painting can be seen as a literal decal, emphasizing the cut out nature of the work. So obviously it looks like it was just cut and pasted right on. But again, he's shifting that positive and negative figure-ground relationship pretty well. And if you were to obviously take the one on the right and switch it with the one on the left, you would have probably like a more predictable image. Still probably pretty weird, but more predictable, because you would have his form blocking out this, and then this would be on the left, so it would be a little bit more predictable. And then again, this is Magritte again, the positive and negative space. So the ground or area surrounding the eyeball and iris is carefully modeled. So this is like obviously a pretty clear representation of a human eye, and he's got all the details, and it makes sense. And then he is asking us to consider the iris to be positive space, but again, he uses the sky, so that's like a recurring theme, but he's using the sky, and this is a traditional negative space to describe the iris. So he's asking us to imagine that the sky is now the active positive space, where it's usually the background. And so obviously he's doing a similar thing here. And I read the sky / iris as the positive space, but I think the piece ultimately leaves me with questions rather than answers, which I think is like a pretty good summation of that. So figure-ground relationship. This is kind of the second piece of this. Positive and negative shapes in a work of art have a figure-ground relationship, whether or not, as I said, whether or not they are an actual figure in an actual background. So this is Barbara Kruger, and the figure in this is I read it to be the large red text, "What big muscles you have." And then the ground is the black type back here and all these names. So the, what did I say about this one? So the figure ground relationship isn't quite as clear in this one, but she does emphasize that the red text is, I don't want to say it's more important, but it's definitely her focus, and that's what she wants us to notice. And it does, like, especially with the exclamation point and just the overall size and the fact that it's the red text, which is kind of when you see red, I read it as more urgent, more like right this second, like maybe emergency or something. And then the background, that sort of just falls back quite a bit. And the text in the background is sort of something that's secondary. So we kind of read it after we read the initial text, which I think is the effect that she wants. So this is like a pretty stark and literal representation of figure ground. Obviously, this is Princess Diana by Sugimoto, and literally just a dark, flat background is the ground. She's the figure, she's the subject, and everything is sort of emphasizing her. And I did note that like the vertical of her dress, and not only the vertical, but the stark contrast, as well as this sort of like texturing up here. These are points of interest, but the effect is sort of like I said it was like a monument, almost like a homage or something of Princess Diana. So obviously, Sugimoto wanted her and only her, pretty much, to be the sole focus of this. So it's obviously a very dramatic sort of. I read it as like a remembrance image. And this is figure ground, positive, negative space. In three-dimensional form. So this is Henry Moore, reclining mother and child. And you can see that there is, obviously it's outside, right? So this is like the ultimate figure ground relationship, because it's not necessarily encapsulated in just a two-dimensional image. And he has cut into his bronze form and let us actually just see right through it. So he's sort of piercing into this bronze, this super heavy material, and he's penetrating it and leaving that openness is a pretty direct contrast to the heaviness, the like solidity of the bronze metal, which is kind of an interesting thing. But the open spaces read and contribute as much to the work as the bronze, in my opinion. And when reading a figure ground relationship in sculpture, many believe the ground is essentially a void, because it's literally all around us, which is, you know, the way it is, excuse me, in everyday life as well. And I said the line between figure ground becomes somewhat blurred when artists situate their work in public or outdoor spaces, which is definitely true. That definitely, and that lends a certain infiniteness to the possibilities of the figure ground relationship. So, so that's mother and child again. So this is a really good example of figure ground reversals. So this is the shifting of viewer perceptions such that what at one moment appears to be the figure in a composition becomes the ground or background, and vice versa. So really excellent example of this is Land and Sea by M.C. Escher. So if you start at the top, obviously you are perceiving these black birds as the positive, and the one at the top is the most detailed and kind of concentrated on. There's like light and shadow effect as well. But as you move down in here, the bird actually becomes simpler and simpler in terms of form, and it's losing some of its detail. They're moving closer together. And before you know it, you're actually focusing less on the black, and you're more starting to focus on the white, which becomes like a fish. And this is very loosely suggested in this top shape, but as they kind of group closer together, you can see that the white is peeking through, and that actually does make the fish's shape. And it continues all the way down, and the same thing at the bottom happens to the fish, where it is the most detailed down here, and the space in between as you're kind of descending down into the water is looking more and more like a bird, especially right on the line. So right on the line, you have this really interesting sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? You have like a relationship that's really interesting. So where the land and the sea meet, you're having the birds and the fish meet as well, and positive and negative is really called into question. Figure ground is really called into question here, because you do start to get some of the detail of the fish, and you still have some of the detail of the birds. So it's like, what are we looking at? And I don't know, I just think this image is really interesting, and I think it's cool too. This is a little bit separate, but I think it's kind of cool that at the top, this bird is the most formed way at the top, and the fish is the most formed way at the bottom, which is like a really clear representation of their sort of stations in everyday life, which I think is kind of cool. But another note that I had was just, Escher wasn't like a master of not only optical illusion, but like technically he was so awesome. But he is asking us to kind of view his work in a certain way. And he's playing with positive and negative shapes, contrast, an organization to create illusion and question what we're seeing altogether. So that's kind of awesome. And here's a visual breakdown of that as well. And then on the line, as I said, questioning positive fish, negative bird, or vice versa. So their meeting place, it sort of becomes, I don't want to say blurred because it's very clear that they're, you know, fish and bird, but I don't know what the word is. I'll think of it. So this is Rodin with his sculptures, Victor Hugo and the Thinker by Edward Stitchin. I think that's how you say it. So in this photo, this is Rodin, the sculptor, and he is sitting opposite his very famous work, The Thinker. And this is a photograph, and Rodin and his sculpture are initially perceived as the positive shapes, while the background is the lighter value. So initially, like when I look at this, I just see these two figures in profile in this really dark silhouette. And then you look more, and the lighter value behind Rodin and the Thinker, you can see that it reveals the likeness of Victor Hugo. And then that actually causes the viewer to shift their perception of the positive and negative shapes in the work, because you're like, okay, initially I think these are the subjects and these are the figures and then this is the ground, but then you kind of have this Victor Hugo in the background sort of ominously floating there, and you're like, oh, he might actually also be a figure, and then what's the ground? Like, it's kind of confusing. But it does push itself like visually up into the foreground because it does have detail, it is recognizable. And there is such a stark contrast, so your eye kind of immediately goes to these places where it's very harshly black and white. So kind of an interesting image. And finally, this is Crash Site by Michael James, and it's really interesting. So he's obviously divided his composition, and this is intended to distinguish whether the artist intended the subjects to be black figures on a white background, or vice versa. So it sort of the entire time that you're looking at this, you're questioning, okay, is this white on black or black on white? And then you have this red right in the middle, and this is like I read it as like the crash of Crash Site, where they're actually meeting. And then this is extremely ordered, obviously on the left, and then on the right, this is seemingly random, and sort of just like, there is an order to it. As I look, especially as I'm like looking again at this, there is a certain order, but it's definitely not as pleasing as this. And one thing that I noticed, and you guys probably notice, you're sort of met with this like vibration, this like pulsating. When you look at this, it's almost like hard to look at it if you're sitting and you're staring at it too long. But it's constantly shifting the figure-ground relationship, and we're kind of just trying to make sense of the piece. And then of course we have this red in the middle, and that is just like adding to it. And I'm not sure what that is. It's like this visual dissonance that's happening with like the black and the white, and then the addition of the red. I don't know, it's like an interesting kind of optical thing that's happening. So this is sort of the boiled down version of positive and negative space in the figure ground relationship. And as I said, they're related and important, and there are definitely things to consider when you guys are doing your next assignment, and you know, just the rest of the assignments for the semester. I do want to just show you guys one or two quick videos that I've got. So so I did this little drawing, and it's just like a pretty clear it's a pretty clear demonstration of using negative space to carve out a positive object. So in this, you'll see, but essentially what I've done is I was observing a chair, and it was in 2-point perspective. And rather than starting by kind of getting the general sketch of the chair in, as we kind of all would. You kind of, when you start doing a drawing, oftentimes you're going to start with your positive objects rather than starting with your negative objects, because that's what our eye goes to. But in this, I'm doing the opposite. So I was drawing a chair using negative space only, and rather than positive space. So you can see it has like a sort of a decal like stamp effect when it's all said and done. But I started this drawing by doing the negative space, as I said. And then after I had sort of cut the shapes out, I went in and started to add some detail onto like the positive object, but it's a pretty short video, so it'll just take a second. But it was actually pretty fun to do. I did this when I was in college, when I was in an undergrad, like freshman year drawing one. And this was the assignment, and I thought, oh my gosh, it's going to be really hard. But it ended up being kind of fun, so I was pleasantly surprised. But you can see I was looking through the spaces in the rungs on the chair to kind of help me define where the chair legs were going to be. So that was pretty fun. For this, I was using fine charcoal, just like vine charcoal, like super soft, very mobile charcoal, just because it, I wanted to be able to move it around. So this is kind of like a fun exercise that you can do, even if you're just like drawing, if you were to draw in your sketchbook, or you wanted to kind of note something and you were maybe having trouble drawing it, starting this way is sort of like a way of shifting your perception. And it can be kind of fun. And then once you start to add detail or texture or whatever to your positive object, and you kind of quiet down some of the white that is sometimes left, you can like have a really dramatic image. So you can see I'm starting to add some like planes. I'm starting to add a little bit of detail, just to kind of suggest what this is that we're looking at, and how light is hitting it. But if I were to continue on this, I would ultimately have like a pretty dramatic drawing of a chair when all was said and done, because I did lay down this background. And of course I could go back in and I could lighten up the background a little bit too, but it would provide a pretty interesting dramatic chair.
How long did it took you to draw the whole thing?
Maybe 15 minutes. It was really super fast. Yeah, it like, I thought it was going to take me a lot longer, but it was a really fast way of working. So it was not too bad. But I also wanted to just let you guys know, I'm not going to necessarily play, I won't play the whole thing here, but I did upload a drawing. So I have been doing this drawing and kind of documenting the whole thing. So as I said, I'm like super slow at drawing generally, but I wanted to tackle this, this project. So I have these like planters. Like, I don't know if you guys can see me right now on the screen. I know I'm sharing my screen, but if you can see me, we have these like planters that we have hanging on our wall of these like fake little succulents, and we have them just like with like that macrame like string or whatever, and we made these like hanging things. And a lot of the time I look at them and I think that the light that is hitting them is really interesting, because it always creates a sort of like diagonal dragged shadow almost across the like wall that's back there. So and it's brick. So I always just look at that. So I decided I would kind of track how I did this drawing with a time lapse. So it ended up being like about 5 minutes. I won't show the whole thing to you guys, but I'll kind of just quickly scrub through it because I did deal with like a lot of different textures in there, and I wanted you guys to at least see how I approached handling them, because it was you had the smooth like the smoothness of the glass that was happening, and then the string, which was soft but also very textured, as well as the succulent leaves, which were sort of like glossy and like kind of rounded, and then the background. So the background was that sort of like shiny brick. And it was just like a lot of different things happening. But you guys can kind of, if you want to, or if you need like help with tackling a certain texture in this next drawing that you guys do, the narrative drawing, you can kind of scrub through this and just sort of see how I built it up. And it's not like completely finished, but I wanted to at least post it for you guys in case you needed or wanted to watch it. And this is all in graphite. So I wanted to document that process just because I'm very slow. So what I'm gonna do now with you guys is I'm actually gonna just stop my recording.